Okay, so it has been pointed out to me that there was a small mix-up with the syllabus, which is completely my fault. I had intended for you to read the two Wordsworth poems, right, Lines Above Tintern Abbey and the Immortality Ode, after we read Wordsworth's Preface, right? So, but the version of the syllabus I gave you didn't reflect that, right? So I know that it says that you were supposed to read the Coleridge Biographia Literaria for today. So here's what we're going to do instead. We're going to go over Tintern Abbey together, right? Whether you've actually already gone through it or not. And we're going to be looking at the Biographia Literaria next time, right? Which is sort of Coleridge's equivalent of what Wordsworth was doing in that preface to Lyrical Ballads, right? Coleridge is writing his program for what poetry is supposed to be like, is supposed to be about. So take this down. Pay very, very close attention. Track these questions very, very closely as you are reading. And, you know, because the Biographia Literaria is probably a little bit more difficult than a lot of the other things we're going to be reading, if you've already read it, it probably wouldn't hurt you to read it again, right? So, yeah. So take this down. Let me know when you're done. And the bibliography is circulating, right? Who did not get one of these bibliography sheets? Where's that not being yet? Did these make it to this side of the room? Okay. All right. Okay, Jeremy, you didn't get one? Drew didn't get one either? Okay. Okay, so didn't make it down your row. Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I give these to you partly for transparency, right? Just because it's good. It's a good scholarly practice to let people know where you're getting your information from, and also in case you do want more information yourselves about any of these readings, this gives you places to go to, right? Particularly when we get around to, say, writing the final paper, right? This way, nobody can come back to me and say, I can't find any sources. Like, no. I have been giving you lists of sources all semester, right? The most important of these questions, by the way, to try to find an answer to is going to be number 3, right? That's going to be the most important for our purposes in this class. So really, really pay close attention to that passage.
Let's do that. I read it about 2 times.
Is everybody almost done here? Okay. Everybody good? Okay. So we'll get rid of that. Okay, so I do also want to apologize for the confusion over the response paper due date. Essentially what happens is that every time they update Georgia View, like they make little changes in the code and it messes with the due dates in my folders. So I saw an earlier due date on Georgia View. I didn't do my due diligence and check against the syllabus, and I didn't want any of you to get screwed by that, right? I figured like worst case scenario, you would just do your response paper a week early. So the first response paper is still due this Friday. The next one will be due next Friday, and so on and so forth, right? So just make sure you have it in by this Friday. I apologize for any stress or confusion this caused any of you. Do any of you have any questions about the response papers, about what you're supposed to be doing, or about what I'm looking for? Okay. I mean, I do kind of have that laid out, like in general, I have that laid out on the sheet, right? But the big thing that I want everybody to try to do, right? I want you to try to contextualize the passage that you're looking at in terms of the things we've been discussing in class about history or about Romanticism generally, right? I want you to try to relate it to these appropriate time period contexts rather than trying to relate it to something in contemporary life, right? Please, please, please do not ever use the phrase "in today's society," right? We're not talking about today's society. We're talking about England in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And yeah, I mean, some of the problems that they had are some of the problems that we had, right? There are some, issues that are consistent. You'll definitely see some analogs between the present and the past, right? But I'm not particularly interested in those. I want to make sure that you can actually situate these texts in the time period in which they were written, right? So that's the thing that I'm looking for you to do. So just pay close attention to what we're doing in class and try to use that in the response papers. Yeah, Alan?
And we can choose a quote or section from any of the readings up to this point?
Yeah, anything we've read up to this point. Yeah, so anything we've read up to Thursday can be in the first response paper. Okay. Any other questions? Everybody clear on this? We're good? Okay, great. So then let's get back into talking about Wordsworth. So can anybody remind me of what Wordsworth's general poetic values and principles, what were the values he placed on poetry in the preface, right? What did he think a good poem looked like? What did he think a good poet did? Pardon?
do prose.
Okay, yeah. Wordsworth does not believe there's a distinction really between poetry and prose, right? That prose, written musically, written rhythmically, can have the same kind of flow as poetry, right? So, poetry and prose can be more or less equivalent. Okay, what else? What else do we remember about what Wordsworth had to say about poetry, or what poetry should, or about his own poetry, his own program for poetry? Yeah, Barry.
Wasn't so much the poem and what it was saying, it was about what the author was thinking.
Yeah, that poetry for a romantic poet generally is usually about mental activity, right? A romantic poem isn't so much about the ostensible subject of the poem, right? So like lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey isn't really about the abbey, right? Although that's what I've got up behind me here. It's about the poet's thought process as he looks down at this abbey, right? Do you remember the model I showed you for what a typical romantic poem looks like? Does anybody remember what that model looked like?
You mean the feeling plus thought?
Well, that's Wordsworth's formula, right? Feeling plus thought, yeah. That a poem is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, right? So you go out into the wilds and you see a thing that makes you feel something really intensely, but you can't write about it in that moment, right? Because you're still feeling too much. So you have to go home, sit, meditate, mull it over, and then you can write a poem about it, right? So yeah, the basic formula for a poem is feeling plus thought, right? Reflecting on a powerful feeling. But what about, did I give you a model for poetry, for romantic poetry specifically, that didn't necessarily come from Wordsworth or anything Wordsworth said?
Isn't it like outside, inside, outside process?
Yeah. This greater romantic lyric, right? In which the poet starts by observing something outside himself. That observation leads to inner musings, which the poet then externalizes again, right? Right. He looks back out onto his environment with changed eyes as a result of this the inside process, right? What does Wordsworth think the language of poetry should be like? What sort of language should a poem be written in?
Isn't it like
Commonly.
Yeah, plain speech, right? A poem should be written in plain speech, right? No fancy rhetorical figures. No 20-cent Latinate words. Poetry should be written in language that an ordinary person can understand. All right, good. So what about the poet himself? How does Wordsworth regard the poet as a figure? How is the poet like or different from other people?
he's better than other people, but he's not at the same time?
Yeah, it's kind of, there's this kind of weird hedging right there, right? So, okay, on the one hand, the poet is a man speaking to men, right? So the poet is one ordinary person speaking to other ordinary people in plain language. But the poet must be a person who feels things a little more intensely, who thinks a little bit more deeply, right? So the poet is a kind of intensified normal person. Right. Normal person times 10. And there's one more thing. Okay, so is Wordsworth's view of poetry and apparently of life, the universe, and everything more rationalist or more organicist?
Organicist.
Okay, and do we remember what the distinction is, right? What does a rationalist believe?
These are the rules, we stick by tradition, we don't change.
Not quite.
Change the rules to fit a more reasonable way.
Yeah, the rationalist believes in an orderly, predictable universe, right? And that you can actually sort of, through observing patterns, you can set rules, right? You can set things up to make things more fair, right? Whereas an organicist believes that everything kind of grows out of tradition, right? And you have to kind of just let it grow wild. So yeah, so Wordsworth is much more organicist, particularly in his opinions about poetry, right? The poetry is not something to be pruned and shaped, although he certainly did a lot of revision of his own poems. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about any of this? Any points of confusion, any comments you'd like to make before we try to apply any of this to Tintern Abbey? No? Okay. So, the picture behind me is of Tintern Abbey itself. So, it's a 12th century abbey, though most of the buildings that survive date from the 14th century. It has been abandoned since 1536. Does anybody know what happened in England in 1536 that would have led to a Catholic monastery being abandoned and ruined?
It's when Henry. Oh,
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Keep talking.
It's when Henry VIII basically threw out the Catholic Church so he can get his divorce.
Yeah. Now, before he did that, he dissolved all the monasteries and took their money.
Yep.
He's a great guy.
So yeah, that's what happened in 1536. Is the dissolution of the monasteries. So Tintern Abbey was itself a kind of casualty of England creeping into modernity, right? As England works its way out of the medieval period towards the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, these medieval church structures are destroyed and abandoned. Right? So, Tintern Abbey sits pretty much right on the border between England and Wales. And Wordsworth, it's in a river valley. The river is called the Wye. And Wordsworth visited this place on a walking tour of Wales with his sister in 1798. And it was this walking tour that inspired the poem that we're looking at today. He started writing it not long after they left the location. So let's just start with the poem itself and see what specifically romantic or specifically Wordsworthian values we can pull out of this. Right? So can I get a volunteer to read the first sort of verse paragraph of the poem? Does everybody know what I mean by a verse paragraph? Okay, yeah, so we see here where the sort of it's not quite a stanza because it's not in a regular form, but there's a part where there's a part where it ends and then moves on to another paragraph. So I'm looking for somebody to read the first verse paragraph. Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
On page 288.
Page 288, yep.
5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with their soft island murmur. Once again I do behold these steep and lofty cliffs. On that a wild, scheduled scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion, and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The days come when I gain repose, here under this dark sycamore, and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which on this season, with their unripe fruits, are clad in one gleam hue, and lose themselves in grooves and
Copses, not corpses. Very, very different.
copses. Once again, I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of supportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees, with some uncertain notice, as might seem, of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone.
All right, thank you, Alan. Okay, so let's sort of start near the beginning here. We'll talk about some of these steep and lofty cliffs, a wild, secluded scene. What common romantic era discourse does that look like to us?
Pastoral.
Steep and lofty cliffs, a wild, secluded scene. How do you feel when faced with steep and lofty cliffs?
Danger.
Okay, it feels dangerous, right? Makes you feel small and insignificant, right? So what's the aesthetic principle that the Romantics are particularly interested in that makes you feel small and insignificant? Yeah, it's the sublime, right? They call this the sublime, that kind of aesthetic of terror, danger, and awe, right? So we start out here in the territory of the sublime. And what the sublime offers here, right? Thoughts of more deep seclusion. Connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. So is the way he's feeling about these steep and lofty cliffs the way we would expect somebody to feel about staring up at steep and lofty cliffs? What are they for him? What does the sublime provide him?
It's kind of like a nostalgic, wistful feeling.
Okay, yeah, there is, yeah, I mean, he's revisiting this site after having been away for 5 years. What were you going to say, Jeremy?
I was going to say disconnection from, I guess, something else, because he used the word secluded.
Mhm.
Obviously, he's by himself.
Yeah, although we'll find out as we read through the poem that he's not by himself, right? There is another person here to whom he's speaking. But what the sublime offers him in this space, right, is space for solitary reflection. Right, the kind of space for him to gather in an aesthetic impression that he can later recollect in tranquility to make into a poem, right? Now, as we keep going here, like, do we stay for very long in the territory of the sublime, right? The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts. Are we still in wild places if we're talking about cottage ground and orchards? Groves, copses, hedgerows, all of these things, right? This isn't wild growth, right? This is cultivated growth. So we go from the wild place to, I mean, we wouldn't necessarily call this a heavily peopled landscape, right? We're talking about orchards, we're talking about cottages, we're still talking about a rural landscape, right? So we're going from wild to simply rural. Which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild. These pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. How many of you are familiar with the song Stairway to Heaven? Okay, yeah, like they're taking that one verse about the rings of smoke to the trees, like right from this stupid poem. With some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. So this is quote-unquote civilization, right? But is it civilization that in any way disturbs the peace of nature? Yeah, it seems pretty harmonious here overall, right? Yeah, what were you going to say, Barry?
More of mountain folk, or what we would call hillbillies.
Although, like the term hillbilly is usually pejorative, right? We don't usually use that term to talk about people we like, right? Whereas here, yeah. I mean, whereas here, like the hermit, right, is someone who sits in the woods by himself for purposes of spiritual contemplation, right? I think he's using hermit in that medieval sense.
I thought, like, this may be silly, but when I read hermit, the first thing that came to mind was like an ornamental hermit. Like, the hermits they had, like...
Yeah. Does everybody know what Ashley's talking about?
Hermit crab.
No, not a hermit crab, no. Okay, so essentially, like, in the 18th century in England, right, rich idiots built these massive estates covered with what were called follies, right? And these follies were like things like, fake caves to hell or fake gates to heaven, Chinese pagodas, right? It all depended on the fanciful imagination of the designer of the garden. But those who were of a more sort of medievalist bent would actually hire hermits to live in a little grotto on their property to give it a more authentically medieval atmosphere. You look incredulous, Jeremy. You don't believe me.
Why would you hire somebody?
Just be a boat.
It's
Yeah.
adorable.
Yeah, well, because you have too much money and not enough to do it. That's why you would do that.
The best
But-
part is that they would pay them to
Yeah.
say like philosophical stuff and entertain them
Sure.
and run around dirty and stuff. It was funny.
But yeah, I mean, like the whole idea here, like it's a different attitude towards the past and to the Middle Ages than we see in the Romantics, right? So Wordsworth is going around looking on a ruined medieval abbey and finding, inspiration in the place as it is, right? The sorts of people who would build these follies and hire hermits to live in them, we're looking at the past as purely ornamental, right? So it's the same kind of cultural problem that the Romantics see in the poetry of their neoclassical predecessors, right? That it's all ornaments. It's all fancy words, right? Essentially, it's all bullshit. And there's no substance behind it, right? There are no real holy hermits living on these estates. But you do find holy hermits referenced frequently in Romantic poetry, which is also looking towards the past, but in different sorts of ways, right? It's trying to recapture something authentic from the past, even if it's not quite getting there. Okay, one more thing I wanted to note about this first verse paragraph before we move on. He's looking at these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season, with their unripe fruits, are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Why point out the green hue of the unripe fruit?
To signify the season.
Okay, well, what season would that signify then, if the fruit's not ripe yet?
Early spring.
Okay, yeah, we're in spring, right? So the tree, the buds have turned to fruit, right? But that fruit hasn't ripened yet, it's still green. And what then is that green fruit indicating to the person looking at it?
New light.
It's not ready.
New life, it's not ready, right? It's potential, right? This is potential coiled up on the boughs of a tree. It's not quite there yet. And remember where we are in the poem here as well, right? We're still in the first early stages of the poem. Right, the poetic fruit hasn't ripened yet either. Okay, so can we move on to this second verse paragraph, starting with these beauteous forms. Can I get a volunteer to read that? Yeah, Ashley, go ahead.
These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me, as is a landscape to a blind man's eye. But oft, in lonely rooms, and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them, in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing into my pure mind, with tranquil restoration, feeling too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have not slight or trivial influence on that best portion of the good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Nor less, I trust to them, I may have owed another gift, of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed mood, in which the affections gently lead us on, until the breath of this corporeal frame, and even the motion of our human blood, almost suspended, we are laid asleep, embody and become a living soul, while, with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things.
All right, thank you, Ashley. Okay, so I wrote a couple of terms here on the board, in part because they're sort of pointing to one of the big philosophical influences that critics have identified on this particular poem. I think we've talked a little bit about Plato before here, right? Does anybody remember anything about Plato and Plato's view of reality?
I think we see just versions of what we see is just a version of something else.
Yeah, everything that we see in the intelligible world, right?
Is a reflection of the perfect form, which is too lofty for us to understand.
Exactly, yes, yes. Everything in the material world is just a reflection of a form. So when he's talking about beauteous forms, he's talking about beauteous ideas recollected in his memory, right? Things that he can imagine, but things that he cannot actually sense directly anymore, right? We're talking about the intelligible and the unintelligible, right? These are terms that Plato uses for that of which we can conceive and that of which we cannot conceive, right? So forms live in the intelligible world, right? We can access them with our intellect. So what this is indicating here is the influence of Plato on Wordsworth's thought, right? That the ideals are what's important, more so than the actual physical sensations, which are just imitations of them, right? So we can put this to work in thinking about these greater romantic lyrics, right, by saying that these sense impressions are only valuable insofar as they relate to or spark ideas, right? The ideas are what matters. Now, what about the attitude here towards towns and cities, towards civilization? Right, these beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye. But oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood, and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. What's the process he's describing there?
Remembering past experiences he had when he was out of the towns and cities, and when he felt this sublime nature, and then looking back to that when he's weary or amid the din of towns and cities.
So how might we put that directly into a Wordsworthian phrase? What would he call this? this is directly emotion recollected in tranquility, right? That is exactly what he's discussing here, what he's describing. It says emotion recollected in tranquility. So, when he is not in these beautiful rural areas, right, he can still recollect them and draw on them for poetic inspiration, right? That's the basic idea there. All right. Can I get somebody to read from If This Be But a Vain Belief? Bottom of page 2. Yeah, Jeremy, go for it.
If this be but a vain belief, yet, oh, how often, in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyous daylight, when fretful, stirred, unprofitable, and the evil of the world have hung upon the beams of my heart. How often, Spirit, have I turned to thee, O Sylvan wide, thou wanderer through the woods? How often has my spirit turned to thee?
Okay, so in the past paragraph, he mentioned forms, right? Ideas that things in the world are imitations of. In this paragraph, he mentioned shapes, right? From a Platonic point of view, these shapes are the things that imitate forms, right? These physical shapes are the false versions of Platonic forms. And how does he refresh himself? What does his spirit turn to when he is stuck in the dreary gray city?
Thoughts of nothing during crazy?
Yeah. But does he have to make those up?
How often, Spirit, I turn to thee, O Sylvan wide. What is the Sylvan wide?
The Sylvan one. Okay, so Sylvan. Does everybody know what the word Sylvan means?
Isn't it relating to fae and fairies? Or at least sort of?
Well, think about where do fairies usually live?
In the woods.
In the woods, right? So Sylvan means of or related to forests, right? Of or related to the woods. And the Y is the river along the banks of which this abbey sits, right? So when he talks about the Sylvan Y, he's talking about this river along the Welsh border running through the woods. And his memory of this is restorative, right? His memory of this place brings him back to feeling when life in civilization has kind of deadened him, right? Has deadened his sensations. Right? That's a big thing that romantic poets are often interested in, is that attempts to kind of renew sensation. Right? Like we tend to get accustomed to particular things, right? We tend to respond to the world around us mostly through habit. And what the romantic poets are often trying to do is get you to look at the world around you through fresh eyes, or sort of through the eyes of a child again, who's experiencing these things for the first time, so that you don't become sort of cold and dead through habit. Right, Jeremy, you want to keep going with "and now with gleams of half extinguished thought"?
And now, with gleams of half extinguished thought, with many recognitions of dim and faint, and somewhat of the sad complexity, the picture of the mind revives again. While here I stand, not only with the sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thought that in this moment there is life and food for future years. And so I dare to hope, though change, no doubt, from what I was when first I came among these hills. When like a road, I bounded over the mountains by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams. Wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one to stop the one he loved. For nature then, the course of pleasures of my boyish days and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling and a love that had no need of a remoter charm. My thoughts supplied, nor any interest unbarred from the eye. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures, not for this faint I nor mourn nor murmur, other gifts have followed. For such loss I will grieve, abundant recompense, for I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of the thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still and sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me, with the joy of the elevated thoughts, a sense sublime, with something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of the setting suns, and the round ocean is the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of a man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects, all thought. Keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
And rolls through all things. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains, of all that we behold from this green earth, of all the mighty world, of eye and ear, both what they have half create and what perceive, well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense, that the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, so what this verse paragraph is primarily concerned with are questions of time and of identity. Now, when we talk about time, if we think about a traditional agricultural community, right, where everybody participates in the planting and the sowing and the harvest, right, where everybody works together on fixing buildings, right, or managing animals, what have you. Everybody kind of watches out for everybody else's shit. What patterns of time matter the most?
Sunrise and sundown.
Yeah, okay. When you get up and when you go to bed, right?
Like the changing of the seasons.
Yeah,
How
seasonal
everything-
patterns are really what's more important, right? So you're typically thinking of time, whether you're thinking in terms of a day, right, sunrise to sunset, or in terms of a season, right? You're thinking of time in terms of broad patterns. Does it really matter what particular hour it is if you're doing this kind of work? Not really, because it's not really measured in hours, right? It's measured by whether or not the task gets done or not, right? And you have to get it done before the season ends. So, by the end of the 18th century, right, we're at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So people are leaving traditional villages where your life is organized mostly according to seasonal patterns and are taking jobs in factories in cities, especially in the north of England and Scotland. And if you're working in a factory, how is your time divided up?
Your time is divided up by the hour.
By the hour, right? Because that's how your wage is paid. Right? You're not working for yourself, right, or for your community. You're working for the guy that owns the machine that you're pulling, and he pays you a certain rate every hour to keep pulling that lever or do whatever it is you're doing, right? So the measurement of time in a lot of poetry in this era becomes an important concern. Right? Time and distance both become much more important concerns than they used to be because both have become commodities. What other change in how we organize our time or our living spaces or how we get around is created by the creation of the steam engine? Right, so we have the factory, right, which sort of starts mostly with these sort of mass-producing textiles. But how does that also revolutionize travel?
Isn't this around the start of the train?
Yeah, we're not quite there yet, right? But in a few years in England, every town is going to have a train station. And what that means, in order to get people on the trains they need to get onto at the proper times, time has to become standardized, right? You can't just go by your ordinary village cycles anymore, right? You have to set yourself to a particular chronological standard that's measured from some central point. Otherwise, the trains don't run on time, right? And people keep missing them. So Wordsworth is trying to think of time more in terms of these kinds of broad patterns, right? We saw that this started with references to the spring. And at the beginning of this verse paragraph on page 290, the picture of the mind revives again. While here I stand, not only with a sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts that in this moment there is life and food for future years. So in his reflections here, he is trying to collapse past, present, and future. Actually, all of these arrows should be pointing both ways, because he's trying to combine all of these into one, right? So the lines that follow then discuss his boyhood impressions of sites like this, how he felt as a child viewing sites like this, how he feels in the present day looking upon this ruined abbey and the valley in which it sits, and how this is going to provide him with food for future thought or comfort or poetry, right? That all time is sort of collapsed into this one moment, this one place. But his level of enjoyment of it depends on who he is at a particular moment. Right? A child doesn't see with the same eyes the adult does. And if we look at the childhood impressions here, right? And so I dare to hope, though changed no doubt from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded over the mountains, by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams where nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. For nature then, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days, and the glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion, the tall rock, the mountain and the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling and a love that had no need of a remoter charm, by thought supplied, nor any interest unborrowed from the eye. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. So, do you notice any particular pattern of imagery in that? Any kind of image that keeps popping up in his description of himself as a boy? What does he compare himself to near the beginning of this? Yeah, a deer, right? A roe, a deer. And then further down, in what terms does he describe his boyish days? Anything that seems in any way related to deer.
Animal movement.
Animal movements of his boyish days, right? Good. So how does an animal respond to its environment? What does it use to navigate its environment?
It's here.
Its eyes.
Okay, it's senses, right? And does an animal impose reason or thought upon its environment? Yeah, instinct, right? Senses and instincts. So as a boy, his response to nature is primarily dictated by his senses and by his instincts, right? And these senses seem to tend towards the sublime, right? The dark and gloomy woods, roaring cataracts, tall rocks, that sort of thing. So that time has passed, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures, right? So he can remember these childhood impressions, but he can't recapture them, right? These are done now, these are gone. Not for this faint-eyed, nor mourn nor murmur, other gifts have followed. For such loss I would believe abundant recompense. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean of living air, so on and so forth, right? So, as an adult, he is able to look on his environment both with the light of reason, of the sense of some animating spirit behind it, right? Whether or not you would call that spirit God, Wordsworth kind of leaves a little bit questionable, right? But he certainly seems to sense some kind of divine presence behind everything else. Now, can I get a volunteer to read on page 291 from Nor Perchance?
Nor perchance, if I were not thus taught, should I ever more suffer my genial spirits to decay. For thou art with me upon the banks of despair, river, thou my dearest friend, my dear, dear friend. And in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister. And this prayer I make, knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. 'Tis her privilege, through all the years of this our life, to lead from joy to joy. For she can so inform the mind that is within us, so impress with quietus and beauty, and so feed with lofty thoughts, that neither evil tongues, rash judgments, nor the sneers of selfish men, nor greetings where no kindness is, nor all the dreary intercourse of daily life, shall e'er prevail against us or disturb our cheerful faith, that all which we behold is full of blessings. Therefore let the moon shine on thee in thy solitary walk, and let the misty mountain winds be free to blow against thee. And in after years, when these wild ecstasies shall be matured into a sober pleasure, when thy mind shall be a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. Oh, then, if solitude, or fear, or pain, or grief should be thy portion, with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me, and these my exhortations. Or perchance, if I should be where I no more can hear thy voice, nor catch from thy wild eyes these gleams of past existence, wilt thou then forget that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, and that I, so long a worshipper of nature, hither came unwearied in that service? Rather say with warmer love, oh, what far deeper zeal or holier love. Nor wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, and this green pastoral landscape were to me right dear, both for themselves and for thy sake.
Thank you. Okay, so what very important piece of information do we learn in this last verse paragraph?
He's with someone else.
Yeah, there's somebody else here, right? Has he been talking in the first several verse paragraphs as though there's another person here?
No, it's more pointed towards this is alone.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of like if you were with him and he was pontificating like this, you probably would have by now told him to shut up, right? So another person who was sitting with him likely would have interrupted him by now. But here in this final verse paragraph, we see, yes, his sister is here with him to some extent sharing this experience, right? And how does he represent her? What is her importance to him?
A beautiful person.
What's that?
He kind of depicts her as a beautiful person, kind person.
Mm-hmm.
He uses the term former a lot, like his past, like she represented something for him.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, he uses the term. Can you give me an example, actually?
My dear, dear friend, and in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes.
Okay, yeah, so what do these lines suggest her value for him is?
She's a reminder.
Yeah, she's a kind of repository of his childhood memories, right? She reminds him of his past sensations and his past selves, right? This is a complaint that a lot of people have about Wordsworth, is that he rarely seems to value other people in and of themselves. He mostly seems to regard them as mirrors into his own soul, right? As reflecting on his own soul. And this is sort of exactly the way the sister seems to be working here, right? We've got the line here that Ashley cited, the language of my former heart, read my former pleasures, and the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. So how does he then proceed with all this in the description of the sister? What is the sister going to become for him?
The memory? Or something to help him remember?
Yeah, an aid to memory, right?
So she's a source of inspiration.
So she is also, yes, a kind of repository of inspiration for him, right? Pardon?
You mentioned her being married as such a dwelling place.
Yeah, can you read that whole passage there, Kanaya, maybe starting from When Thy Mind?
You said when my mind.
Yeah, near the bottom of page 291.
Oh, when thy mind shall be a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as well a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies.
Okay, you can stop there, thank you. There's that word forms again, though, right? Thy mind shall be a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. So, what is he gonna store in his sister Dorothy?
The memories of these lovely forms and dwelling places of the sweet sounds and harmonies. So it's filled.
Well, forms aren't feelings, right? What are forms?
The perfect idea of things we see.
Yeah, forms are ideas, right?
Oh. So he's about to store his idea of his own happiness?
Well, forms aren't just ideas of happiness, right? Like forms are ideas of anything that we can imitate in the physical world. Yeah, Kendra.
Maybe since his sister is there with him, she's sharing that experience with him of being in this place. And it's a beautiful place. And so whenever he's with her and he thinks of her, like he'll think of that memory that he's made with her, that she deserved.
And all of these ideas developed through sensation, right? He can recall through her, even if he can't remember them himself, right?
Is it?
Her mind becomes a dwelling place. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's like, it also feels like it feels more like she's an object more than she's another person. And I know you mentioned that
Mhm.
he likes to use other people as like mirrors into his own soul, which is like
Mm-hmm.
really pretentious, but whatever. So like, it seems like he's making her out to be something. Like I was gonna ask, like, how does he know the memories that he had of like these like Sylvan places are like real, or are they just romanticizations?
Yeah. It's okay. I think, yeah.
Romanticization
Uh-huh.
of like his memories, because
Mhm.
none of us really remember what we did as children. Like I remember being sweet and wonderful, but to my brothers and sisters I was terrible. So like,
I don't think I was ever sweet and wonderful.
So you're saying that the recalled memory is always imperfect?
yeah, like he presents it as like this perfect, beautiful
Mhm.
idea, or like something like into a form.
Mhm.
But because of the way the human mind works, that can never be the case.
Right, the forms can never be fully realized in the physical world.
Mhm.
Right, the relationship between between form and shape, right, is the shape is always an imperfect representation. So these perfect representations, these ideal representations, he stores with his sister, right? Am I reading you right here? Am I okay?
This is also is this the one that was kind of creepy with his sister? Because that would add a layer to this. That I
Yeah, there are some rumors of creepiness. I mean, one, they were unusually close for an adult brother and sister. They lived together for quite some time. And they didn't grow up together, right? Their parents died when they were quite young, and they were sent off to separate homes, as was normal then. All of the Wordsworth siblings were kind of raised in different households. I think I probably mentioned this already, but William Wordsworth had no sense of smell. And biologically, it's smell that tells us not to be sexually attracted to our relatives, right? They don't smell right to us, or they don't smell attractive to us, right? In that particular way. But yeah, because Wordsworth had no sense of smell, then he had no biological compulsion to obey that particular taboo.
So
And she was fairly devastated when he married.
So what you're saying, she was a repository for something else entirely.
I'm not saying that she was. I'm not saying anything more about this, because we're then veering too deeply into biography and psychology, right? But yeah, it's not necessarily any sexual feelings he may or may not have had for his sister are not necessarily relevant to the poem, right? What is important in the poem is the way he's treating her as a kind of storehouse for ideas, right?
Like a backup file.
In a way, yeah. I mean, she's almost more like a flash drive, yeah, yeah. Which is a fairly depressing way to think about one's relatives. I guess depending on how you feel about your relatives. But I digress. I'm not okay. So let's just look at the very end of the poem one last time quickly before we go. Right. If I should be where I no more can hear thy voice, nor catch from thy wild eyes these gleams of past existence, wilt thou then forget that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, and that I, so long a worshipper of nature, hither came unwearied in that service? Oh, with far deeper zeal of holier love, rather say with warmer love, with far deeper zeal of holier love, nor wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear, both for themselves and for thy sake. So, what would happen to his memory of this place and to her memory of this place if they should be separated from each other.
It would fade.
Yeah. The perfect memory, right? The ideal memory here is the combined memory. He'll remember things that she won't, and she'll remember things that he won't. So if they go their separate ways, neither of them will have a complete memory of the experience anymore, right? Neither of them will be able to fully draw on this repository of forms and images that the visit to this abbey created for them. So it's a weird kind of like union of minds thing here, right? We got kind of the two minds working in tandem, even though he seems to regard his own as the primary here, right? His own is the sort of primary working, right? So to apply this to this greater romantic lyric pattern that we cited at the beginning of class, right? So this is that outside, inside, outside thing that we discussed last time, right? He starts by discussing the environment that he's in, right? The sense impressions that he gets from it, right? Although he never actually specifically mentions the abbey. Right? We know it's there because it's in the title, but it doesn't actually appear in the poem. Viewing the environment leads him then to muse on his childhood impressions and on the nature of time and its effect on identity, right? Then he projects these reflections back out onto another person in that final verse paragraph, right? He starts projecting these ideas he's developing out onto the sister. So this is about as perfect a representation of this greater romantic lyric as you get, right? It follows pretty perfectly, pretty ideally, that outside-inside pattern. And I want you to keep that in mind with any other romantic poetry that we read, right? We're going to be looking at a Coleridge poem next week. We're going to be looking at some John Keats poems, right? All of them do this, right? They're not necessarily aware of doing this. This isn't necessarily part of romantic theory. It's something that other people noticed they were doing later on and gave a name to. But they're pretty much all doing this most of the time, right? Does anybody have any questions? All right, so Coleridge for next time, right? Biographia Literaria. As I said, it might behoove you to pay very, very close attention and track the reading questions very closely.